All right, what is up, everybody, and welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the Progressive Era, which is a lot like the Gilded Age, and it overlaps in a lot of ways because it's the time period when people were trying to correct a lot of the problems that were taking place during the Gilded Age. And if you'll recall, there were a lot of problems happening in the Gilded Age. Workers being taken advantage of, Native Americans being wholesale slaughtered in the West and pushed onto reservations, the impact and effects of industrialization and urbanization. And what we're going to start talking about with the new progressive era, which is roughly going to be kind of the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, with some of these progressive groups into the early 20th century, into, and past even World War I, almost up to the Roaring 20s. This progressive era, we're actually going to start with agriculture. We're going to start with the farmers. And I've talked a little bit about this, but remember that farmers have got a lot of issues going on. The number one issue that they faced was overproduction. And overproduction sounds like a good problem to have, that you have too much of something. But when there's a surplus, remember the basic laws of economics, supply and demand, okay? That when you have too much of something, what happens to that price? It goes down, right? Okay. And so farmers had been producing too much. This is going to lead to a severe drop in most agricultural products in their pricing. And that meant farmers not getting enough money. They're going to be severely hurting. Another problem that farmers are going to face, remember from the Gilded Age, you have these robber barons. And the first of the big monopolies that formed with these robber barons was with the railroad industry. Guys like Cornelius Vanderbilt, right? You had the Northern Securities and these many other railroad monopolies that had formed, not to mention, the huge corruption and scandals involved with the railroad, such as the Credit Mobilier scandal under Ulysses Grant's presidency. And so railroads know that they have a monopoly on transportation. If you're a farmer and you need to take your crops to market, the railroad is the best way to do that. It's really the only way if you want to make money during this late 1800s time period. And so railroads are going to overcharge farmers. So the railroads are another problem that farmers are facing in the late 1800s. A third problem is that you have many of the banks foreclosing on farmers. As farmers are overproducing, as railroads are overcharging them, farmers are not able to pay back the mortgage on their land or on their tools that they had, taken out these loans for. And so the banks will foreclose and they will be repossessing the farmers' homes. The last and final problem is Mother Nature. Now, there's not much you can do about Mother Nature, but it is going to be another factor contributing to the downward slide of many poor farmers during this time period in the late 1800s. And a series of droughts, really, really hard droughts, that is going to be another problem farmers are facing, not allowing them to make a living. And so what do farmers do because of these problems? Well, they're going to unite and politicize. They're going to organize political groups in order to advocate for themselves and their farm issues in order to benefit and improve their lives. The first group that forms was the Grange movement. And out of the Grange movement, you're going to get the farmers' alliances by the 1880s. A way to remember the Grange movement, remember like you're going out on the open range, that's where you'd have like your farms with your homesteads and whatnot. And so kind of remember that for helping you remember that the Grange movement was a lot of these poor farmers, particularly out west. You'll also have some poor farmers trying to unite and advocate in the South, but remember for sharecroppers, they're also dealing with racist problems as well, because particularly after the Civil War in the late 1860s, most of those sharecroppers were African American, although there will be a growing number of poor white sharecroppers as well. And these farmers' alliances, these become a lot bigger, a lot bolder in their political action. You start to have representatives of these farming political groups, of these farmers' alliances, getting elected to not only local office, but even starting to get elected to state office. And like Robert La Follette in Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, somewhere up there. Robert La Follette in Wisconsin gets elected to state office. He's going to be advocating for the national government to take partial ownership in some of these industries that were hurting farmers, particularly the railroad industry. He's also going to be advocating, like a lot of these poor farmers, for poor common American folk, mostly white folk, to have more political rights and speech, more democracy in America. And we'll see more common Americans getting more political representation and more political power during the progressive era in reforms such as the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. So out of the farmers' alliances you finally get by the late 1880s, early 1890s, dun, 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 the beginning of the People's Party, or the Populist Party. And they speak eventually for all the producing classes, not just the farmers. Again, we are farmers, that's where they start off as, but they will eventually be also advocating for all of the working class interests in the United States. So eventually they're also going to incorporate, like many of the labor union activists, many of the poor factory workers in the United States at this time. Remember, this is trying to correct the problems of the Gilded Age. One of the biggest problems were the way that factory workers were being treated like slave labor, like machines, basically, so easily replaceable. And there is a great analogy for this time period and for the rise of the Populist Party in this book that comes out in the year 1900, written by Frank L. Baum. And this book is called The Wizard of Oz. And there is a famous movie that you might have seen or at least heard of, I'm sure most of you, that came out about this book in the year 1939, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And that was also one of the first big blockbusters to be in Technicolor. You know, when Dorothy, this little farm girl, opens her farmhouse door after being sucked into this magical new world by a tornado. She was from Kansas, and she gets to this magical land of Oz. She opens the door, and then, oh my goodness, there's color. And it's all this beautiful, vivid color in the movie. It was one of the first movies to have Technicolor. But the book that it's based off of has been made into an allegory of this time period, a tale of the Populist Party, these poor farmers. And so if you follow this allegory, this message, this story, and the metaphors that it represents, you'd kind of be able to track what is going on. For instance, Dorothy would represent the common American people. You'd have like the first friend that she encounters on her journey being the Scarecrow, which is the poor farmers, the ones who start the farmers' alliances, the Populist Party. And then from there, the next that they meet, the next friend that they meet is the Tin Man. And the Tin Man is supposed to represent the poor industrial workers, the factory workers, because again, he's being treated like a machine. And remember that each of these friends, they want to get to the capital of Oz with Dorothy because they want to ask the wizard for something as well, some value that they think they are lacking. For the Scarecrow, it's a brain, trying to say that these farmers are dumb hicks or, you know, rednecks, or that they don't know what they're talking about. They're poor, ignorant farmers, you know, out west. But we come to see by the end of the story through all of their adventures that the Scarecrow is actually the smartest of them all. He's incredibly brilliant. And it's the poor farmers that found this political party, a third party, not Democrats, not Republicans, a third party, the Populists, that are going to have tremendous impact on the United States because many of the populist ideas will become laws. The Tin Man, he's searching for a heart, saying again that the industrial workers are like machines. That they're unfeeling. Well, of course, that's not true. They're people being treated as disposable. And so at the end, we find out he's the most caring of them all. The third and final friend that Dorothy meets is going to be the Cowardly Lion. And if you follow through this populist metaphor, then the Cowardly Lion is supposed to be like the leader of the Populist Party, because like lions are like, you know, the leader of the animal kingdom and stuff. Go watch The Lion King. That is William Jennings Bryan, the great commoner, the great populist leader who will run for president in 1896, in 1900, in 1908, and he will lose all three times, but he will become one of the most famous and most important Americans in all of our history, because again, these ideas that he brought to the forefront of national politics will become a reality, such as the 16th Amendment. It's why we pay our income taxes come every April 15th. It's going to be also the 17th Amendment, why we get to directly elect our senators. It's from the Populist Party. And so that's a nice allegory, a nice way to remember kind of some of the key characters and what was going on during this time period. And if you want to follow that through a little bit further, the Yellow Brick Road is like the gold standard that populists were trying to get rid of. The Wicked Witch of the West is like the hazards of the Western frontier, which would racistly make like the Native Americans the monkeys, I guess. Toto, her little dog that Dorothy has, is like the teetotalers, that movement that was about temperance and prohibition to end alcohol in America, constantly following along. So that's something to kind of help you out with this time period. The populists, these poor farmers who are going to unite and try to get changes to help improve their situation, they embrace modern technologies, the railroad, the telegraph, the telephone, the national market. They just want the government to take more ownership of these things, to put regulations on them so that they are not taking advantage of these poor farmers. What they're advocating for is basically what you call socialism. Socialism is kind of like a halfway between capitalism and communism. It's what many, European nations today, we consider their sort of economy to have, where it's much higher levels of government regulation on private businesses than like what we have in America, but it's not communism where like the government completely controls all means of production. It's a halfway point, and that's kind of what these farmers were wanting. They wanted government ownership of the railroad companies. They wanted government ownership of the telegraph, and so on. Maybe they wanted a little bit more communism. Karl Marx, by the way, was the German philosopher, you could say, who is going to write the Communist Manifesto in the 1800s, for which the idea of communism springs about. The idea that workers will unite and overthrow the capitalist governments and create a workers' paradise where everyone is treated equally, where all means of production are owned by everyone. But to do that, you have to kind of evolve, and the government has to take control of everything to get to that point, to that utopia. And of course, it's in that evolution where it always goes awry because you concentrate too much power with any leadership and it becomes corrupt. Ultimate power corrupts absolutely. Okay, so the Cowardly Lion. Why is he called that in the story if he's the leader? Well, again, just like the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion, who was seeking bravery from the wizard, he actually was the bravest of them all. He just needed to find the courage inside himself, right? And William Jennings Bryan, he's not a coward or anything, but he does get labeled as one. Remember in our lecture on the Spanish-American War, I briefly mentioned how he had tried to serve in that war, just like Teddy Roosevelt had, to make a name for himself. But unfortunately, he'd been hit with dysentery for most of the war. And it was a very short war, happening less than 4 months, so he had to sit most of it out. So that's where he does get some charges of this. He also later on, during World War I, will be advocating for American neutrality to keep us out of the war. Another reason why he gets the moniker, maybe for being somewhat cowardly, although he is not. He is a devout Christian, and there are many places out west that are named after William Jennings Bryan because of the enormous impact he's going to have on behalf of fighting for the poor, the common people, the poor farmers, the industrial workers. One such place is actually where A&M University is today. Remember, it's in Bryan College Station. Well, that Bryan is named after William Jennings Bryan. So in 1896, the Populist Party, they have tried unsuccessfully so far to elect a candidate to the presidency. What they're going to do in 1896 is actually kind of team up with the Democratic Party, who'd been floundering. Now, remember, there had been many close elections in the late 1800s, but there'd only been actually one Democrat that had been elected to the presidency from the Civil War onward to 1900, and that was Grover Cleveland, who was elected for those 2 non-consecutive terms. And so what's going to happen is that the populists are going to kind of take over the Democratic Party. These poor farmers, the commoners, the industrial workers, they get a majority of the votes, and they're going to choose William Jennings Bryan as their candidate, as their nominee. So while he is the populist, the leader of this farmers' party, the People's Party, power to the people, he will be running as a Democrat in 1896 against the Republican William McKinley. We already know McKinley, spoilers, he's going to win this because he's going to be president during the Spanish-American War in 1898, remember. Now, what Bryan is fighting for is the Populist Party platform, okay? And platform is what a political party stands for. It's their values, their beliefs, what they want to enact once they get elected to office. And so what Bryan wants is, and what the Populist Party want is they want bimetallism. They want to end the gold standard that America had gotten back onto since the late 1870s, and instead have America's money based off of not just gold, but also silver as well. And the reasoning for this is that gold is very limited, right? It's a very valuable, exclusive substance. If you took all the gold in the entire world, you could only fill up like a few Olympic swimming pools. Like there's not that much of it in the entire world. And yet that is what our money is based off of. We cannot have more money than there is gold to back it up. So that makes for a very limited money supply. If we were to have our money be based off of something else as well as gold, then we could have more money supply. We could have more money. And more people would have access to money were that the case. At least that was the logic behind the bimetallism push and the silverites of the Populist Party. And so that's what's meant by bimetallism. Have our money be based off of not just gold, but also silver, because there is more silver than there is gold. So in the gold standard. And Bryan will actually give a very, very famous speech about trying to get America off the gold standard as he was campaigning for the presidency in 1896. He does like a whistle stop tour. So he's speaking from the back of a caboose on a train. And everywhere the train stops in all these little towns all across America, he's getting out, he's kissing babies, he's shaking hands, and he's giving this, what we call today like a stump speech, a speech that a candidate gives again and again with just slight variations. And Bryan's famous speech, one of the most famous speeches in American history, is called the Cross of Gold speech, where he says, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. He also says, America, burn down your cities and it'll be fine, but America, burn down your farms and we're all going to be destroyed. Talking about the importance of the agricultural industry in the United States, that the farmers form the backbone of the American economy and that they need to be assisted because, again, that's his constituency. He's a populist. He's speaking for these poor farmers, the Populist Party. And the Cross of Gold is, of course, referencing the evils of the gold standard, how it was suffocating the money supply and basically causing there to only be this much money where most of it was in the hands of the wealthy few, robber barons. And then there was only just a tiny bit left for everybody else. So we needed to increase the money supply so that more people could have more money. Okay, that's what that speech was about. And so that's going to be William Jennings Bryan, who runs for president in 1896 against William McKinley. Bryan was also, I think, just 36 or 37 years old. He was really, really young when he ran for president the first time, and then he loses, and then he's going to go off to try to fight in the Spanish-American War, and he comes back again in 1900, loses again. We'll see William Jennings Bryan is a major force in American politics well into the 1920s. In fact, in 1925, just days before his death, he participates in one of the most famous American trials in all history. It was called the Scopes trial, or the monkey trial, which was a trial about evolution and science versus religion and about what should be taught in American schools. And Bryan, as a devout Christian, will play a key part in the prosecution of that case. He dies just 6 days after it. But we'll be talking more about the Scopes trial later on when we get to the 1920s. But this is William Jennings Bryan, again, known as the Great Commoner. Probably he met, spoke to, visited, showed compassion for more Americans than any other man up to that point in our history. And he's versus the Republican candidate, William McKinley. Now, by this point, the Republican Party, it's still the party of Abraham Lincoln to some extent. It's still the party from the Whigs, still the party from the Federalists before them. But increasingly, the Republican Party is seemingly being controlled by the interest of big business. And you really see that transformation happen under William McKinley. He gets huge campaign contributions from the robber barons in 1896, and then even more so in 1900. They spend millions of dollars on his campaign to ensure that McKinley gets elected and Bryan loses. Now, why would they do this? Well, think about it. It's because what is Bryan talking about doing? Well, part of the Populist Party platform is calling for government ownership of their companies. So they don't want that. Part of Bryan's platform is talking about the common people getting paid more, being treated fairly. All these things will cost these businessmen more money, and they don't want to do that. And so they actively campaigned against Bryan to ensure his defeat. They had their floor managers speak to their employees and basically threaten them and cajole them and bribe them and everything else, telling them, don't vote for Bryan. If you do, you will lose your job. And so it's all this coercion and all of this money that is spent that will ensure McKinley's victory in 1896, even though it's Bryan who is campaigning on behalf of the working masses of America. And for this reason, that's why we kind of call the election of 1896, it's a political turning point. We're going from the third party system kind of into the fourth party system, where the political parties are starting to resemble a little bit more of what they look like today, especially with this populist infusion into the Democratic Party. Because before that, it was very muddled on, their values differences, right? And it's also considered the first modern presidential election, 1896, because of the amounts of money that are spent, the campaign finances that take place. Mark Hanna is William McKinley's campaign manager, and he's running the show with all of this money from the robber barons. They basically own the president. That's the power of campaign contributions. You help get somebody elected by spending your money. You're ensuring that you will have a voice in their administration. It's like buying your way into that office, and it's extremely corrupt, but it is something that we have happen all the time. In fact, if you look at, I'm giving this lecture on January the 4th, 2021. It's 2021. If you look at the Georgia runoff race that is taking place, tomorrow on Tuesday, January 5th, you will see that there are unbelievable amounts of money that have been spent on it. So this is the runoff election for the two Georgia Senate seats to the United States Senate. And just in this runoff that's happened from November to now in January, they have spent close to $350 million on these these two Senate elections. Now, for the 2020 presidential race that Joe Biden won in November of 2020, there was nearly $14 billion spent. Like, campaign financing is big money. There is huge money in politics today, and this is not a good thing. And it all began with 1896. Campaign contributions are a serious problem, and campaign finance reform, it's hard to get it passed because what politician is going to want to curb the amount of money that they're getting, right? And so this is a problem that has developed since, and it is something that we are still dealing with today. Okay. And so McKinley gets elected 1896. He's also going to defeat Bryan again in 1900, and then McKinley's going to get assassinated in 1901, paving the way for the first progressive president, Teddy Roosevelt. William McKinley was not a progressive. He was an imperialist. He was an expansionist, but he is going to be in the back pockets of the robber barons. That is going to be J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and those guys. And when I say that McKinley's victory shattered the political stalemate, remember in the Gilded Age, it was within 1% each of these elections where Republicans would just barely win the presidency and Congress was back and forth. And there was no clear winner between the Republicans and Democrats. Well, McKinley, he wins pretty decisively with all of this money that he has at his disposal versus Bryan. Turns out, you know, being the champion of the poor people, don't have a lot of money. All right, so we will stop there for today. Thank you guys so much. And just remember the Populist Party platform, what they stood for, because although they don't get elected to the presidency, they still made things that are going to affect our lives to this day. They wanted to have government ownership of the railroad and telegraph and other industries to help poor farmers. They don't get that, but we do get regulations like the Interstate Commerce Act because of their efforts from like state leaders like Robert La Follette there in Wisconsin. It's because of the populists that we're going to get increased reform in terms of the common people having more political power. This is going to be like state reforms such as initiative, referendum, and recall that we'll be talking about. It's because of the populists that you get the 16th Amendment, the graduated income tax. It's because of the populists that you're going to get the secret ballot where people are not supposed to know unless you tell them who you voted for. It's going to be because of the Populist Party that you get the 17th Amendment, the direct election of United States senators, because before this, it was the state legislatures that would choose the United States senators. The people didn't get to have a direct say there, meaning the senators didn't have to listen directly to the people. So again, Populist Party, it's these poor farmers that started it, but it's gonna be all about power to who? The people, because that's what populism means. Thank you guys so much, and I will talk to you later. Bye.